Hi everybody, welcome to our second lecture for ATI140. So the early colonisers and explorers often described Australia as a harsh, tough and hostile environment. They assumed that indigenous people were nothing but scavengers who took whatever they could get from the land and moved around aimlessly. Indigenous people, however, lived in an easy and simple life. The land provided them with everything. All they needed to do was look after the land. And this, of course, involved painting, conducting ceremonies, singing and dancing. For Indigenous people, the most important thing to do in order to ensure that you were going to feed yourselves and your families is to sing songs and to perform dances, not so much to practice your spear throwing techniques, for example. So the early explorers believed that because they could not see any signs of cultivation and there were no signs of permanent dwellings, there could be no permanent occupation. When the early explorers first arrived, Indigenous people lived in what anthropologists often refer to as bands, B-A-N-D-S. Now these bands are typically small numbers of people ranging in number from anything between 10 to 70. Now, these bands were typically brothers with their wives and their children, and individual members of husbands' and wives' families. Now each band would have their own estate, an area of land that they looked after and they had responsibilities to. Australia is the only country that does not have a treaty of any form between its Indigenous people and its colonisers. As I said last week, some of the reasons why there was no treaty is because of the issue of representation. Who speaks to the government and negotiates a treaty on behalf of all Aboriginal people? Well, there is nobody. Other issues include the geographic circumstances of Australia. In countries such as New Zealand, people were able to come together, share a same language, and therefore when the colonisers arrived, they were able to observe practices that they were familiar with, such as a military presence, large villages, etc. And of course they were able to negotiate in one language. And of course in countries such as New Zealand they had Indigenous kings and queens who assisted in those negotiation processes. So the issue of representation was not an issue. At the time early explorers arrived in Australia, terra nullius was one of the three recognised ways of acquiring sovereignty over land. There were three ways: conquest, cession, and occupying land that was not owned by others. The lack of signs that were familiar to the settlers, as I said, is one of the reasons why there was no treaty in Australia. The early explorers did not see any alterations to the environment because Indigenous people's religious connections to land prevented them from doing such things. All they had to do was adhere to the obligations left to them by their Creator ancestors. Also, their social organisation meant that they shared everything. Everybody was looked after. There was no need to think about tomorrow because the land provided for everybody. Because of this, they made no attempt to establish things such as gardens. They didn't need to because they were surrounded by gardens that they could use whenever they wanted to. They didn't have to labour over it. Indigenous people in Australia had contact with Indonesians, the Dutch and Torres Strait Islanders and others, and did not find the need to adopt any of these groups' ideas about food production. To them, these things just seemed like an unnecessary burden. The land provided regardless. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about country. The term country is a term that you're going to hear regularly in this unit, and you will hear spoken regularly by Indigenous people. Now, as we saw last week, simple terminology can easily lead to miscommunication and different perspectives. We see this with the term country. To non-Indigenous people, country is a nation-state with its own government, like Australia, for example. To Indigenous people, country means a specific local place. It is an area of land that people have spiritual connections with. An area of land that has its own stories that are associated with the creation of people who live on that land. Last week I explained what sacred sites are. I explained that Indigenous people believe that their Creator ancestors put them on the land to look after the land. Now, looking after the land involves knowing songs, dances and ceremonies, and knowing art designs, knowing what materials to use for these things, knowing where to get them and when to gather them. To Indigenous people, country is alive. People are related to it. People care for it, visit it, sing to it, dance for it and talk to it. Because Indigenous people believe that country is alive and that they share the same Creator ancestors as the land, they have a deep connection to it. This connection comes out in a human type of relationship. Indigenous people believe that water, land, trees are their kin, and they believe this because they have the same Creator ancestor. So this connects them to land. They believe that maintaining this connection is essential to their identity and their health. When they are sick, they visit country and they eat country. Indigenous people believe that they know their country. They believe that they know when it is sick, when it is sad, and when it is well. Country is another one of those Aboriginal English terms that came about when Indigenous people were using English terms to refer to their land. To Indigenous people, there are lots of countries in Australia. All of these countries have their own people, their own laws, their own songs and dances, and their own ceremonies and stories. Country is a term that has become embedded in Indigenous vocabulary among both urban and remote people, so much so that the Australian Government's Natural Resource Management Program is called Caring for Country, and the National Indigenous Ranger Program is called Working on Country. In Week 8 we'll discuss this Indigenous Ranger Program a bit more. Now, when Indigenous people use the term country, there is no distinction between the place they are from, the dirt, the rivers and the trees. They are all one. Fulfilling obligations to land includes being on land and using land. One of these obligations is burning country, and I'm going to spend a few minutes now just talking about burning country. Burning country is an important aspect of Indigenous natural resource management. Their Creator ancestors brought fire with them and showed Indigenous people how to use fire to look after country. Fire, of course, is not just used by anybody. People must go through a rites of passage process to gain knowledge, and even then, fire is only used by the select few to look after country. This is because if it is not done properly, it can be dangerous and destructive. It can damage or destroy sacred sites, important animal breeding grounds, and of course can cause health problems to Indigenous people. However, this knowledge of fire today is being used by younger people employed in ranger groups who are applying this knowledge to look after country. So these younger people have not necessarily gone through those rites of passage to obtain this information. The information is being made available to them so they can look after country. Western scientists from around the world have recognized the importance of Indigenous burning practices. Recent scientific studies have shown how skillful, advanced these burning practices are. The land that the settlers and explorers found was in fact the remnants of thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous people burning country. To burn country is to openly demonstrate your knowledge and authority over country, and to demonstrate your connections to country. Fire is used to expedite plant and flower growth and seed germination, and it is a way of bringing country back to life, to promote new life. So when you burn something, it comes back clean and fresh and green, and it attracts animals that you can then hunt to eat. If Indigenous people see country with evidence that it is being burnt, they know it is healthy country. They know that people are looking after it. Indigenous people light fires for different reasons at different times of the year. These different fires take into consideration heat, dryness, surrounding vegetation and wildlife, wind, and the presence of smoke. Indigenous people believe that if they do not burn country, the country will not be able to look after them, as it will be covered in weeds, beer grass and shrubs, and this will mean that Indigenous people cannot locate water, food and medicines, and that many plants and animals will die. A healthy country is one that people and animals can see and move around on. They can travel through and across it, they can hunt for meat, fruit and vegetables, find water, conduct ceremonies, and fulfill their obligations to their Creator ancestors.